Look at a political map of Africa, and something immediately stands out. Many borders are astonishingly straight. They cut across deserts, forests, rivers, and communities as though someone placed a ruler on the continent and drew a line. In many cases, that is not far from what happened. So, why are Africa's borders so straight? The answer begins with European empires, but it is important to clear up one common misunderstanding. Africa did not have no borders before Europeans arrived. The continent contained kingdoms, empires, city-states, trading networks, and political communities with their own territories and spheres of influence. These boundaries were sometimes flexible, and they did not always look like modern national borders, but Africa was not an empty map. European powers gradually built coastal trading posts from the 15th century onward. For centuries, however, most European control remained near the coast. The interior was difficult for Europeans to enter. Tropical diseases killed large numbers of outsiders. Rivers were not always navigable. Powerful African states controlled trade and territory. Then, during the 19th century, the situation changed. Industrial technology gave European armies steamships, repeating rifles, machine guns, and improved communications. Medical use of quinine helped Europeans survive malaria. At the same time, European governments became increasingly obsessed with empire. Colonies promised resources, prestige, military bases, and new markets. They also allowed European leaders to claim that their country was stronger than its rivals. This triggered the scramble for Africa. In 1884, representatives from European powers met in Berlin. No African representatives were invited. The Berlin Conference did not sit down and draw every modern African border in one meeting, as the story is sometimes simplified, but it established rules that accelerated European claims and occupation. A country could not merely announce that it owned a coastline. It was expected to demonstrate effective control. That encouraged European powers to rush inland before someone else did. Britain wanted routes connecting its colonies. France wanted a vast belt across West and Central Africa. Belgium's King Leopold II claimed the Congo as his personal possession. Germany, Portugal, Italy, and Spain also competed for territory. Diplomats negotiated with one another using maps that were often incomplete. Straight lines were convenient. A line of latitude, longitude, or a ruler-drawn connection between 2 points was easier to describe in a treaty than a boundary based on local political realities that Europeans often did not understand. Some borders did follow rivers, mountains, or older political divisions, but many were designed to settle arguments between European empires, not to create coherent African states. The people living on the land were rarely consulted. As a result, some communities were divided between several colonies. Other colonies forced together groups with different languages, political systems, and historical relationships. This did not automatically make conflict inevitable. Diverse societies can and do form successful countries. The deeper problem was that colonial governments were designed primarily to extract labor and resources, not to build representative states. European rulers often governed through selected local elites. They classified people into rigid ethnic categories, rewarded some groups over others, and suppressed resistance violently. The Congo Free State became one of the most brutal examples. Under King Leopold's rule, people were subjected to forced labor, hostage taking, mutilation, and mass death in the pursuit of rubber and ivory. Elsewhere, colonial armies crushed states that resisted occupation. By the early 20th century, nearly all of Africa had been divided among European powers. Ethiopia and Liberia were the major exceptions, although Ethiopia itself was invaded and occupied by Italy for several years in the 1930s. Then after the Second World War, African independence movements gained strength. Colonial rule had become harder to defend morally and financially. Veterans returned from war. Educated political leaders organized parties and unions. Protests, negotiations, and armed struggles challenged European control. From the 1950s through the 1970s, most African colonies became independent countries. But independence created a difficult question. Should the new countries keep the colonial borders or redraw the continent? Redrawing them might have corrected some colonial divisions, but it could also have created endless disputes. Almost every new boundary would produce new minorities and new claims. African leaders generally decided that the existing borders, however flawed, should remain. In 1964, the Organization of African Unity affirmed respect for the borders inherited at independence. The aim was to prevent the continent from descending into constant territorial war. This decision brought stability in some ways, but colonial borders continued to shape politics. Some countries inherited ports, railways, and roads designed to move resources outward rather than connect communities internally. Some had long, difficult borders that were expensive to control. Others contained regions that had been governed very differently under colonial rule. Still, it would be wrong to blame every modern African problem on straight lines alone. African countries have now had decades of their own political history. Local leaders, global powers, economic systems, and social movements have all shaped what happened after independence. And many borders elsewhere in the world are also artificial. The difference is that Africa's colonial partition happened unusually quickly, was imposed mostly by outsiders, and occurred during the age of modern mapmaking. That makes the lines especially visible. So Africa's borders are often straight because European empires were dividing territory from distant negotiating rooms. Straight lines were easy to write into treaties, easy to place on maps, and useful for preventing European powers from fighting one another. They were not designed around the people who lived there. The map was created to solve Europe's imperial arguments. Africa was left to live with the result.